No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed, or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Well, this is Young Heretics. I'm Spencer Klavan, and that is clauses 39 and 40 of Magna Carta. This is an extremely exciting episode of this show because we have another honorary heretic, another guest on the show. People have gotten mad at me for calling people honorary heretics. You are not a heretic in a religious sense by any means. But this is sitting Senator Ted Cruz, who's here to join us today and talk about Magna Carta and the U.S. Constitution. Welcome, Senator.
Well, I revel in the title heretic.
Oh, good.
And we as Americans, the American journey has been heretics against tyranny, against government power. And I have to say, I'm probably even more proud since 6 months from now I will have my 50th birthday. That I apparently still qualify as young. So I am. My daughters would scoff at that, but I'm proud to join you nonetheless.
Well, age ain't nothing but a number, and I constantly remind people that the young in the title is a young youth in spirit. So you are more than welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. The heresy to which the title refers is specifically heresy against identity politics. So basically, we study on this show. We study the West without any of the political garbage that's kind of infected the universities. And the goal is to give people, the classical education that a lot of folks, I think, right now are being denied because they consider it racist or what have you. And, this is an exciting opportunity for us because in many ways, you as an active senator of the United States, you are an inheritor of the best that the West has to offer. When's the last time somebody said that to you? I mean, do you think about that?
We stand on the shoulders of giants, and so I am blessed to do so, and blessed to be an American. So I agree that we have inherited greatness. The question is, will we preserve it or will we squander it?
Well, that's right. No, I think that the subject that we're here to talk about is especially timely for exactly this reason, because people. They think of America, a lot of people, folks more and more, I think of America as something sort of crass and modern. They don't realize that not only are we the inheritors of the American tradition, but we're the inheritors of a number of fabulous traditions that go much, much further back than that. I mean, we're here particularly to talk about English common law, but all the founders were deeply read in the guys that we talk about in this show all the time. Cicero, Sidney, Locke, all these people. And so what I'd like to do today, if it's all right with you, is just sort of talk through a little bit of this kind of older heritage of your tradition, and then sort of pick your brain about some of the deeper principles that underlie.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm just going to launch in for people that maybe don't know what Magna Carta is or what the heck we're even here talking about. So Magna Carta goes back to this guy, King John. He's kind of the center of it all. Most famous thing that anybody ever said about King John is by John Gillingham, a great historian of the Middle Ages. And the famous thing that he said about King John is King John was a shit. And that's basically kind of like, we can basically stop the podcast right there because that's, as you know, right, tyranny is a big part of the American tradition. As you just said, rebellion against tyranny is huge for us, I think.
So I will confess, although I enjoy learning, I am also, and we are here in Hollywood, in the belly of the beast. I am a huge movie fan, and I will note in Robin Hood Men in Tights, they decree at the end of the movie that King John, henceforth, toilets shall be known as John's, which the quote you have cited is appropriate for many venues.
Particularly apposite. In fact, the barons, after John died, they convened, to sort of think about who would be king next. And they considered another person named John, but they decided that nobody named John could ever rise to the throne. So, as you say, like there's always a grain of truth in Men in Tights, I think, when you really dig down.
And I'm not sure rise to the throne necessarily conveys.
Yeah, exactly. So what does King John do? So you mean you could sort of go on forever about the list of his. Matthew Paris, who's kind of one of the great sources for this period of time, says that, dark as it is, hell itself is defiled by King John. So that's how bad this guy is. He kills his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, en route to the throne. He is famous for sleeping around with every possible nobleman in his court, with the wife of every possible nobleman in his court, which is obviously not a good way to win fans. He's the heir to the Plantagenet Empire, which is actually a kind of Frenchy empire. It takes place mostly in the north of France, but he loses that, and in order to win that back, he basically just has to tax these barons, these rich noblemen in England, up the wazoo. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? Taxation without representation, that sort of thing. You're probably well acquainted with that.
Indeed.
Form of argument. So, okay. What happens? The barons basically get fed up being taxed just to pay for this, what eventually turns out to be a completely unsuccessful war to take back the north of France. At the Battle of Bouvines, King John fails spectacularly. It's an utter disaster. And the barons eventually rebel and they take the city of London. So they force John into kind of a treaty in order to lay out their own rights. And the first thing that they decide to say is that the king will have to grant now to God certain rights that all English noblemen will now have. So the king is going to be, the language is bound to the law of God. And that's where you get the stuff that I read at the beginning, right? That nobody shall be deprived of justice without due process of law. Here's where I'm going to stop for a second and just turn it over to you, because right now a lot of people are saying essentially that all of this stuff, these old English noblemen, and eventually, pretty soon we're going to get into how this influences the American founding. Basically, this is all just dead white men. What does any of this, why should we be here talking about this at all? The Constitution, King John, anything like that? What does it matter?
Because it is integral to the protection of human liberty. If we look at most of the history of the world, for most of the history of the world, it is a history of monarchy. It is a history of absolute power. And it is often a history of tyranny and oppression and misery and suffering. Now, some form of governance is needed. Right. Anarchy. Hobbes famously wrote that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So without some form of rule of law, everyone's rights becomes a Chaz autonomous zone where the strongest warlord takes from the weakest warlord.
Right.
And the Magna Carta was a major step, and there have been multiple steps in terms of safeguarding individual liberty against unchecked government power. That government power in anyone's hands, it doesn't matter deeply if they are malevolent or benevolent, that unchecked power is corrupting. And the Magna Carta, now, as you rightly noted, the Magna Carta was not, at the time, a defense of commoners. It was not a defense of peasants. It was the rich aristocracy, the noblemen,
right,
rising up against the monarch and saying, damn it, protect our rights.
And there's all sorts of stuff in it, by the way, that is very specific to that. So there's, the fishing rights in the Thames, for example, not one of the major issues right now. Right?
But if you're beginning with unlimited monarchical power, limiting that power is a step in the right direction. And it works towards, and you also look at thinkers, people like John Locke, who wrote about, who was an incredibly influential thinker for the framers of the U.S. Constitution. And John Locke wrote about the natural rights of man, what it means to be a human being. And the three central rights that Locke articulated are the rights to life, liberty, and property.
Indeed.
And how to secure and protect those rights has been the central journey of Western civilization. Now, one can look at the Magna Carta and say those evil, inequitable bastards, they only protected the rich aristocrats and not the commoners, and that was true. But the journey of expanding rights towards a vision, and a vision that became articulated of the natural rights of everyone, even though it took time for the law to reflect that. That's a vision that ultimately is a profound vision of justice and equality for all.
I want to go back to something you said, because you touched on something that's been very important for us on this show, and that is, we call it the cycle of regimes, or the Greeks called it anacyclosis. And we've talked about it in terms of Chaz, actually, exactly, that, when you have a kind of lawless mob, the first thing that happens is you get a warlord. And we did see that in Chaz Chop, or whatever you want to call it. And the word that you use that's so key, right, is arbitrary, that the power, even in a monarchy, there's a difference between just sort of pure imposition of willful power and somebody saying, actually that first sentence we grant to God, or that first clause, is a way of invoking something that actually stands outside and above all humanity. That has, as you noted, that Hobbes and Locke are kind of part of the carrying of this tradition forward. This has resonance for us in America today too, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you think of the American journey, where the colonies were started as British colonies.
Right.
And they were subject to the crown. They were subject to the authority of the monarchy. Now, the monarchy had been constrained. It had been constrained by the Magna Carta. It had been constrained over times, but it was still a monarchy.
Right.
And the American colonists chafed under what they saw as arbitrary authority, what they saw as distant authority, what they saw as exploitative authority. And you look at the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, we celebrated July 4th, 1776, where the colonists declared their independence from Britain, and that was a declaration of war. It was an extraordinary, you want a document for a show called Young Heretics?
Yeah.
It was as heretical, and there's several things at the heart of it. One, the justification not only of the British crown, but of many monarchs in many countries, had been the divine right of kings. It had been the notion that God selects, anoints, in some societies imbues with divine power the ruler, and sovereignty extended downwards. It extended from God to the monarch to the subjects who are ruled. And in turn, rights, and even rights at the time of the Magna Carta, remained to some extent gifts by grace, much like crumbs from the master's table, that you can go and petition, I'd like a crumb, but it was dependent upon the beneficence of the master. So the Declaration and the American founding, one of the most extraordinary things it did is it inverted the concept of sovereignty. Instead of sovereignty starting at the top and extending down, it began with the principles that sovereignty exists with the people,
right,
and extends upwards. And so the Declaration famously said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And those words, all men are created equal, I mean that in the annals of history is an extraordinary, revolutionary. Most of humanity for millennia had believed men were anything but equal, that there were some meant to dominate and rule. There were kings and queens and monarchs and aristocrats, and there were peasants and commoners that meant to be subjugated. But that's not what the Declaration said. All men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator.
Right. Now,
remember before, when it's the kings, it's God that makes the king sovereign. But in this case, no. It is the Creator who gives all of us certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Now, there's a fascinating sort of precedent for this in the history of Magna Carta, because somebody that we haven't talked about yet at all, but who was hugely important for the brokering of this eventual, what's really, initially, it's a peace treaty in 1215 between the barons and the king. And one of the major sort of central figures that mediates between these, this guy, Stephen Langton. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1207 onward. But before that, for for 40 years, he's been one of the foremost sort of theological professors in Paris. And one of the things he's been doing is just commenting almost word by word on the Bible. And he's been very deeply kind of immersed in this before he enters his real sort of political. And one of the things he does or discovers from that is that in Deuteronomy, one of the books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, is that God actually says what his laws are. He doesn't just sort of say whatever this guy tells you, that's what you do. He says these are the rules. And that's part, I think, of how the barons are able to hold the king not just to his own kind of arbitrary imposition of power, but to the rules that are objective, that are something we can appeal to from outside. Here's the irony in all of this for me, and tell me what you think. I mean, when you think about the American Revolution, and you've already alluded to it, you think about rebellion against the UK, against England. And yet here we are sort of talking about the British precedent for this, as you said, heretical act. How do we where does that come from?
Well, the signers of the Declaration appealed to the rights of Englishmen and to the principle of taxation without representation. And the Declaration was a list of grievances against the Crown, that they were being taxed and taxed heavily, and yet had no say in governance. But it was, even though it made that appeal, it was an act of rebellion. At the closing of the Declaration, the signers pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. And those are not empty words.
No.
Great Britain commanded the mightiest military on the face of the planet. And, we're seeing a resurgence in appreciation for Alexander Hamilton. And I'm grateful for Lin-Manuel Miranda for that, and Broadway. And it's a wonderful show. I took my daughter to it when she was 10. There's a great song of King George when the colonists declare independence of "You'll Be Back."
Masterfully played by Jonathan Groff. Yeah, that's a great song.
Spectacular. Yeah. And by the way, as the song says, we'll send our armies, and they sent their armies to conquer, murder the rebels. And so when you signed, John Hancock famously signed his name so big that King George could read without his spectacles. They were signing their death warrants, and they knew it.
Right.
And those death warrants were met with ships carrying soldiers that came to defeat the colonists. And the Revolutionary War, it remains one of the great miracles of history that a ragtag bunch of colonists, and most of whom were not professional soldiers, right, many of whom were farmers, many of whom were preachers. They were ordinary citizens. Many of them lacked basic clothing, lacked shoes, were fighting in hard terrain. And most of the American Revolution, we lost battle after battle after battle, and yet somehow managed to keep going and then stun the world with victory. And look, there is, one can make an appeal to natural rights, one can make an appeal to divine providence, but for most of the history of the world, it has taken force to overthrow the yoke of tyranny. Not always, but it did certainly in the founding of America, and that force set us on the journey that we're still on today.
We've completely forgotten, I think, the stakes of this, the way that you are describing it now, that it takes blood and treasure. And in addition to kind of pristine theological, philosophical, political ideas, it takes a commitment on the part of, energized human beings.
It's worth anyone watching Google what happened to the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And you can find many places on the internet just a listing of how many of them lost their lives, how many of them lost their children, how many of them lost their homes, had their homes burned to the ground. So some of the stories are truly tragic of many children, all of whom were killed. I mean, signing the Declaration was extraordinarily risky and remains fraught with consequence, among the most consequential acts in the history of the world.
It's crucial. I mean, you made reference to, Acton sort of said it best, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as you've said, despots don't give up power easily.
The other version of that is power corrupts. Absolute power is kind of fun.
I'm sure that's true. I wouldn't know personally, being a humble podcaster myself, but, I have no doubt that that's the case. And I know that, whenever any set of individuals asserts their God-given rights over a tyrant, in many cases it takes not only the deaths of many patriots, but it also takes reassertion, right? I mean, this happened with Magna Carta, 1216, 1217. It wasn't until 1225 that the version that we have now.
And by the way, the Brits came back in 1812 and burned Washington, like it wasn't even done when we won our independence.
Right. No, it's never quite over, in some sense. And I think that in many ways you can understand American history as just a constant, it hasn't always, thank God, it hasn't always taken blood and arms, but it is a constant act of reassertion of that sort of fundamental idea. As we're talking about this, I am struck with the gravity of it. I'm struck with the weight of an idea that people have been willing to die for, and also with just how little we understand this. I wonder what your thoughts are. Why is it that it only takes a few generations for the weight of this to be lost upon us?
Look, a big part of the problem is that our schools don't teach it. They don't recognize the importance of it, and it's not just the Declaration. So the Declaration, we fought a Revolutionary War, we won. The first iteration of America wasn't, in fact, America. It was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, so you got a picture. You got 13 colonies. They'd just shaken off the yoke of the British Crown. And the colonies viewed themselves as much more separate and not quite nation states, but with far greater sovereign authority. And so the Articles of Confederation were a loose confederation, created a federal government with really limited powers, and with limited powers of taxation, with very limited powers to prevent economic warfare between the colonies. And you had real problems of and it's hard to imagine now of one state setting up tariffs and barriers. You can't trade with the neighboring state. And they became, a little bit like the bickering nations of Europe. That's one way to think of the Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And so they appointed delegates to go suggest revisions to the Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. And the delegates arrived in Philadelphia, and they did something extraordinary. They said, let's not revise it at all. Let's write something new. Let's write a constitution of the United States. And they debated in that hot, cramped room. Some of the most extraordinary patriots and geniuses ever assembled came together.
Now, return with me for just a second to that notion of education, because what you say, I believe, is absolutely true. I personally take it almost as an article of faith that this was a providential moment in the history of the West, and gathering together this sort of long, many thousands of years worth of fighting and dying for especially liberty, but for a number of different ideas that had come in and out of fashion over these many centuries. But, and I've heard you talk about this already out on this trip as you're doing, a number of other podcasts. I've heard you talk about the 1619 Project, for example, which in many ways is ascendant in the university system. And it's part of why this show even exists.
It's coming to the grade schools and junior highs and high schools.
It is, right.
The 1619 Project is a revisionist history project designed to propagandize, to lie to, and to brainwash our children. And it is everything we have said about the Magna Carta, about the Declaration, about the Constitution. We will shortly talk about the Bill of Rights. The 1619 Project seeks to tear all of that down. And it, with the enthusiastic embrace of our modern media and much of the academy, and I think it is incredibly dangerous.
And with a Pulitzer Prize behind it as well. Right?
And by the way, when I say it's a revisionist project, those actually aren't my words. The New York Times admits that's what it is, that they want to rewrite American history. So it didn't begin in 1776. It didn't begin with the Constitution, but it began in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America. And it is so tendentious that it argues every aspect of American history focused on the preservation of slavery, which is an absolute and blatant lie.
Right.
Slavery is the original sin of our nation. It was a grotesque abomination. It was evil. It was wrong. Now, slavery has existed on much of the globe and much of mankind's. We talked a few minutes ago about what a heretical statement was the proposition that all men are created equal.
Right.
Many other nations across the globe, in continents across the globe, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, had slavery. In America, our founding documents began with the propositions that set the stage for undoing slavery. And we fought a civil war. There were 600,000 Americans died to expunge slavery. And the abolitionists, and the 1619 Project reads the abolitionists out of American history. They don't exist. And it is every bit as deceitful as is communist propaganda put out by Mao or Lenin or anyone else seeking to deceive and lie.
In many ways, everything we've been talking about here is in itself a kind of refutation of this 1619 argument, not only because, of course, right, I mean, this point has been made before, that the fundamental idea of America is an anti-racist idea, is an anti-slavery idea, the fundamental idea that all men are created equal, which took time, of course, to be played out in practice. But
and let's pause for a second. So one of the critiques is Thomas Jefferson, the man who penned those words, was himself a slave owner. And so people have said, well, what an incredible hypocrite. And at some level, that is true. And listen, we are all imperfect men. But now, not all of the signers were slaveholders. Not all of the signers of the Constitution were slaveholders. There were impassioned abolitionists among them. But Jefferson, in writing it, enshrined the objective, the principle that all men are created equal, and men is meant to encompass women as well. But not only that, we talked about the natural rights of human beings being life, liberty, and property. If you'll notice, Jefferson's enumeration is not life, liberty, and property, but rather is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the reason for that is slavery. That Jefferson didn't include property because they didn't want to enshrine in the Declaration a defense of what would be used to defend slavery, that at the time, slaveholders argued that other human beings were property. And so pursuit of happiness is another word for liberty.
Right.
I mean, they are synonymous, but the reason for that alteration was because it wasn't lost on anybody that this was setting the stage for the end of the evil that was slavery, but it took another 100 years to get there.
It's a profound point, and it's very moving because not only are the founders in this moment reaching back in time into the very roots of English law, whence they themselves come, but in those roots, what they're finding is a transcendent and universal principle which reaches out into the future even beyond themselves and their own flaws and imperfections, which again is something that's, as you've said, is completely erased by the 1619 narrative. But let's come, in fact, to the Bill of Rights, because this is one of the central ways, I think, in which this natural law tradition finds its way here.
So let me pause you for a second, just to revisit the Constitution initially. So you've got James Madison, who's often referred to as the father of the Constitution, who proposes all sorts of brilliant solutions to bring people together. One of the great challenges was that you had different colonies that became different states that had differing populations. And so what to do when you have a Delaware and a Rhode Island that are tiny little states or tiny little colonies that have tiny little populations, and when you have a Virginia and a New York that have big populations. Now, understandably, the Delawares and Rhode Island said, damn it, we're just as important. If it is a pure parliament, where we're represented by population, we're going to be little pipsqueaks and no one's going to care about us. Whereas Virginia and New York said, well, wait, we're big and populous. And if it's going to be equal representation, which is how the Articles of Confederation work, then it doesn't reflect that we are many more people. And one of the great compromises of the Constitution was creating the House and the Senate. And so the House would reflect population, and it would be allocated based on the number of people living in each state. But the Senate would have 2 senators per state. And actually, in the original version of the Constitution, senators weren't elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislatures. And so it was meant as a check. You know, the Supreme Court wrote, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote that the genius of the framers was splitting the atom of sovereignty. So what does that mean? So we talk about how they inverted sovereignty. They started from the ground up, from the people up. But they also divided it, and they divided it on a horizontal axis, on a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. On a vertical axis, they divided sovereignty between the federal government, the states, the local governments, and the people. But on a horizontal axis, they divided sovereignty between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, the 3 branches. And what's interesting, so you often hear people decry gridlock.
Right.
If you study the Constitution, you learn that gridlock isn't a bug, it's a feature.
It's by design. I mean, Madison is quite brilliant about this in Federalist 51. So, the Federalist Papers, the kind of essay is written in defense of this very system. And by the way, in this essay in particular, Madison is reaching back not only to Magna Carta, but to the Roman system, which we talked about also on this show, of counterbalancing sort of various forms of representation against one another. But splitting the atom is nice. I've never heard that before.
Well, and the purpose of it, so the Federalist Papers, after the Constitution gets released, number one, people are shocked. They were set to revise the Articles of Confederation, and suddenly now they have a brand new Constitution. What did you do? That wasn't what you were sent to do. People are shocked, and then there's a debate, a national debate, even though we're not yet a nation, about whether this is the right idea. And there become 2 parties, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist, arguing for and against the Constitution. And the Federalist Papers are op-eds, and they're op-eds that are written by James Madison, by Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who would become the first Chief Justice of the United States. And they wrote under a pseudonym. They wrote under the name Publius. And they wrote these op-eds arguing for this Constitution that had just been crafted, why it protected liberty, why it was wise. One of the most important is Federalist 10. Now, Federalist 10 is written by Madison. It talks about factions. Now, factions is a weird term. We don't use that a lot today. A way to think of factions is special interests. And essentially what Madison says is that in any form of government, there's a danger that one faction or another will seize control, that one special interest, that if power is concentrated,
right,
somebody can seize that power. And we get back to the same problem we had with kings and queens and tyrannies, that if power is concentrated, the people who get screwed are the people.
Right, right.
And so what the Constitution, and this was truly a genius revolution, was to create a robust system of checks and balances where each branch of the federal government would fight against each other.
Right.
That where Congress and the president, they're supposed to fight.
Yeah.
Because if everyone joined together, if all power were unified, that power then is directed against the people. But if the president gets tyrannical, Congress presses back. If the judiciary gets tyrannical, the president and Congress presses back each. And the idea that Madison so brilliantly expresses in Federalist 10 is if they're fighting each other, they ain't fighting you. Another way Jefferson put it, and I love this quote, is Jefferson described the Constitution as chains to bind the mischief of government.
That's lovely, yes. No, it's funny, we had somebody write in because as I mentioned, we've talked a lot on this show about the various different forms of regime, various different forms of government. And I was going through, you've had things like monarchy and oligarchy or aristocracy and then sort of democracy or mob rule. And someone wrote into me and said, doesn't the American government kind of combine all of those together, which is, of course, a very astute comment, because it's another way of saying exactly what you've just said, that basically the American system counterbalances against one another all the various flaws and failings of the different ways to organize your state, essentially. No, it's magnificent. And so
and that we got here, you mentioned before divine providence, and I believe that was very much the case, that it was an extraordinary collection of people. We're having this debate about tearing down statues.
Right.
And if you actually study the framers, the founding fathers, they are some of the most extraordinary human beings to ever walk the planet. The presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention was George Washington. George Washington had been the commanding general who defeated the British Army, who won our independence. And one of the most remarkable moments in history is after the Revolutionary War, Washington was offered the crown. It was not preordained that we would be a republic, that we would have democratic institutions.
Right.
This was primarily a war against a distant monarchy, and there were many who came to Washington and said, okay, let's have a monarchy here now. You're the obvious choice. And think about it for a second. I mean, when's the last time someone offered you, why don't you be the king of America?
Oh, just the other day. But that's, I suppose, no, never. It's never happened to me.
And Washington said no. He turned it down. And it's one of the great acts of self-restraint. That limitation, had Washington been a man of hubris, a man of arrogance, we might well be in a monarchy today. And who knows where the history of America and the world would have gone.
I mean, forget if he had been a man of arrogance, right? If he had been a lesser man at
normal,
all, right? Just a normal dude, yeah.
And by the way, he might have said yes. Let's suppose he was noble and kind. And he said, you know what? I'm going to be a kind king.
Right.
We still would have lacked the rights of a free people.
There is only one other person that I can think of in the entirety of the history of the West who has ever done what you're describing Washington having done here, and that is Cincinnatus, the Roman who gave up his dictatorial power essentially in the very early history of Rome. And he's like maybe a legend. We don't even know if he was real, right?
And Washington was compared to Cincinnatus for that reason.
Right. No, he wasn't. Didn't they make statues of him, basically making him look like? Yeah. No, I mean, and to have a real life Cincinnatus at the origin of your nation is just no small thing.
And by the way, fast forward, Washington becomes the first president of the United States. Mm-hmm. In all likelihood, Washington could have served as president for his entire life.
Right.
This was as great a national hero as our nation had certainly up to then ever seen, but maybe has ever seen. I think only Lincoln potentially rivals Washington, and one can make good arguments on either side of that.
Right.
But he served 2 terms. He served 8 years. And then Washington voluntarily said, I'm done. I'm going to step down. I'm going to retire to Mount Vernon. And I'm going to pass on rule to someone else. And it became John Adams, the second president, who had been Washington's vice president, passing on rule. In the history of humanity, that doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, you pass it on to your son. You pass it on to your heir, passing it on to another. And no one, look, John Adams was a great man, but no one in his time or since has ever argued that Adams was of the stature, certainly not physically, but intellectually, morally, in every regard, Washington was at a different level than Adams. And for Washington to say, we need America to have a tradition of the peaceful passing on of power, that we're not a nation, no one's above the law, we're not a nation of rulers, but we're a nation of law. That decision to step down was almost as important as the decision not to accept the monarchy.
It takes a spectacular degree of personal virtue, the kind of thing that you're describing. Another thing I think that we don't quite appreciate, because we hear these, we've heard these stories maybe as kind of trite, rote recitations in civics class or whatever. We don't understand.
Yeah, it ain't about a cherry tree.
No, it ain't. And it's not, it's not like a small thing. That notion of being a nation under the laws, that's another thing that I think bears revisiting, because we think a lot, and rightly, in this country about our tradition of liberty, of freedom. And we get some of that we get from not the Romans, but the Greeks, right? This idea of democracy. But a passage that I always come back to is from Herodotus, the great historian of the Greco-Persian Wars, in which Xerxes, the king of this autocratic empire, is marching out to war against the Spartans and the Athenians. And Demaratus, who's a kind of rebel Spartan king, has basically been exiled, and he's now in Xerxes' retinue. And Xerxes says, "Why are these little, podunk nobodies standing up in the face of my mighty army?" And Demaratus says, "The Greeks will resist you until the last one of them is dead, for they love their freedom and they love their laws." And that's the part that we forget, right? We forget that we love our laws also, which again is contained there in this idea that we've been talking about: Magna Carta, natural right, all of this stuff. I don't want to hold you for too long. I know you've been out here doing. I doubt very much that anybody listening to us needs to have your podcast Verdict advertised. But if you have not seen Verdict with our mutual pal Michael Knowles and Senator Ted Cruz, I highly recommend it to you.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't do a brief bit of pitching for that, and encourage, if you haven't signed up to subscribe, you can do it where Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get podcasts. You can also do it on YouTube. You can give it a 5-star review. You can sign up for notifications, and we put it out typically about once a week, and we try to dive into issues. I'm not sure I would quite say it is as erudite and learned as this show, but it does endeavor to understand what's going on in the great issues of the day, what the challenges are facing America, and to try to explain it in a way that hopefully people learn, but that is also fun. And that gives one of the things we really try to do in the Verdict podcast is give the behind the scenes, the inside story of what's going on in the Senate cloakroom, what's going on in the Oval Office, what's going on that you don't get on the 6 o'clock news. And that's, I think there's the real need for that, and to explain the principles of our founding, the principles of freedom, and why these principles matter.
It's a great show. I shouldn't just joke that everybody's already seen it. It's fantastic. If you have not, one more time, it's Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, you didn't know
and
this.
You can go to verdictpodcast.com.
Yes, thank you. And rate, subscribe, give it 5 stars. That's Verdict with Ted Cruz. You didn't know this, Senator, but the minute you arrived here in Los Angeles, we locked the state of California back down. You didn't realize that this was all just a ploy to keep you here. And we're just so desperate for Republican leadership that, unfortunately now you have to stay here.
Well, California is a beautiful, beautiful state that is plagued with some foolish and tyrannical political leaders.
That's true.
And I married a native Californian, and there is extraordinary natural beauty here. There has been a great tradition of commerce and innovation from California, but right now you suffer under some really bad policies.
Honorary Heretic Ted Cruz, it has been such a delight and a pleasure to have you on to talk about the founding today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining Young Heretics. It's been a pleasure to have you with us to sit in on this chat with Senator Ted Cruz. We will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.